Hello everyone, my name is Orla Nicontilla and I'm the Digital Communications Coordinator at Carlow College St Patrick's. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture in the Leaving Cert lecture series, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 1831, The Political Monster. Today's speaker is Dr. Simon Workman, Programme Director of English and History and Lecturer in English at Carlow College. Simon's research interests lie in Irish modernist writing, suburban Irish culture and literature, and more recently, contemporary British and Irish Gothic literature. He's currently editing a collection on contemporary Irish Gothic entitled Haunted Hibernia. If you have any questions during the lecture, please post these via the Q&A button at the bottom of the website and we'll put these questions to Simon to answer at the end of the lecture. We'll also be publishing the full lecture on YouTube and we'll send a link along with the lecture slides to all attendees. Now I'd like to hand over to Simon for today's lecture.
Thanks very much, Orla. Welcome, everyone. So the title of this lecture is On the Edge of Humanity, because one of the themes that I'll try to trace today is the way that Frankenstein challenged us to think about new ways to be human and the consequences of those new types of humanity. The first thing to say, I think, about Frankenstein is it certainly, to my mind and other critics' minds, it's one of the most influential books of all time. First of all, as a Gothic work, it is of colossal significance and has created, I think, one of the most famous Gothic monsters in the pantheon of the greatest Gothic monsters. Dracula, you might include in that as well. It's also in many ways the ground zero of modern science fiction, and it popularized this sort of mad scientist figure that we've encountered now endless times in books and films since, and has asked us to think in really deep ways about what effect science might have on humanity if it's employed in an unheeded manner. In that sense, it's also a remarkable book of speculative fiction. One of the extraordinary things about Frankenstein is still how relevant it is to our lives, and actually how increasingly relevant it feels to me, at least, and other critics, as we sort of move into the 21st century. In terms of its meanings, I think part of its brilliance is that its capacity to generate so many different types of meaning. So it has been read, and these are only some of the strands, I think, of the ways it can be read, as a novel of about the dangers of careless scientific ambition. And a really fundamental critic, I think, in that regard is Anne K. Mellor in her book, Mary Shelley, Her Life for Fiction or Monsters, which to me is still the most comprehensive account of Shelley and indeed Frankenstein. It's also been read as a sort of feminist reflection on women's experience, birth and parenthood. And one of the first authors to do that, or the first instances of that type of reading, was in Literary Women by Ellen Moores in 1976. It's also a book about discrimination based on class, disability, and race. And H.L. Malchow's Frankenstein's Monster and Images of Race is a classic text in that regard. It's been read as a political novel about the process of social revolution. And Lee Sternberg's Mary Shelley's Monster, Politics, and Psyche in Frankenstein is another article I'd recommend in that regard. And finally, more recently, it's been read as a philosophical examination of what it means to be human, or indeed post-human. And that's, if you want sort of more information about that, Andy Mousey's essay, The Post-Human, in the Cambridge Companion to Frankenstein, is excellent in terms of that regard. How might we account for this multifaceted reading of the novel? Well, that's something I'm going to try and do today, to talk about the different ways that it can be read. I think there was a first base into this. We might just remind ourselves about what the book is about. So what's often forgotten is the book begins with Robert Walton, who's a polar explorer, and his letters back to his sister. And Walton is trying to make it to the North Pole and find the Northwest Passage. He's also trying to discover the secrets of magnetism. And while he's doing that, he meets a scientist called Victor Frankenstein on the ice. And Victor Frankenstein proceeds to tell his story about creating the monster or the creature or the demon or the wretch. The monster's given lots of names in the book. Victor, we learn, is originally from Geneva in Switzerland. He becomes obsessed with chemistry as a young boy, and also galvanism, which is a theory about electricity in animals, which I'll talk about in a second. As a young man, he moves to Germany, to Ingolstadt, and eventually in the university, under the care of the professors Waldman and Kemp, he develops his own theory of life, basically. And after many experiments, he manages to create a creature made of dead body parts and indeed dead animal parts, it seems, because he searches in slaughterhouses for it. And he creates this creature, this large creature. But as soon as the creature comes back to life, he immediately abandons it. Now, in the book, contrary to maybe the sort of filmic adaptations of Frankenstein, there is no detail, not much detail about how Frankenstein actually brings the creature back to life. He says he gives it the spark of life, but there's no real detail about how he does that. Um, More recently, we tend to think about Frankenstein on the far right there as this sort of green creature with bolts on its neck, and it was brought back by electrification. But in the book, there's a fair degree of ambiguity about that. In any case, as soon as Frankenstein brings the creature back to life, he immediately is disgusted by it and abandons it. And he leaves the monster essentially to wander off into the wild to survive on his own. The monster eventually learns how to kind of take care of himself and moves in beside a family called the DeLacy's. And he begins to love them from afar and their sort of warm family unit. And he attempts to integrate himself into the family by introducing himself to the blind father of the family, who initially accepts him, but once his children return, they scream and beat the monster and send him away. Just to say that the monster's appearance in the book is not green with the bolt in his neck, as I said. That came from one of the first film adaptations of the book with Boris Karloff, very famous adaptation. He actually has yellow skin, black hair, and pearly white teeth, and he's 8 foot tall, which just to sort of, I know it's obviously very tall by our standards, but in the early 19th century, that would have been particularly tall. The average height was 5 foot 5 inches. And just as an aside, during this period, there was a very famous giant just before Mary Shelley was born called Charles Byrne, who was from County Derry. And he was famously born in a haystack, apparently. But he would have been famous in London, the London that Shelley would have been born into, as a sort of a physical freak, you might have said. And he made his money by exhibiting himself at the time. Frankenstein was even taller than him. So he would have been freakishly large, basically, to the people that he encountered. So he learns to survive. He tries to integrate himself into the Lacey's, but the Lacey's reject him bitterly. And that enrages him, and he leaves. He burns down their house after they flee. In his travels subsequently, he actually saves the young girl from drowning, but his reward for that is to be shot by the young girl's father, who just sees this freakish, terrible human being or half human being and punishes him, even though he doesn't realize that Frankenstein's monster has actually saved his young girl. Eventually, he makes it near to the home place of Victor Frankenstein, and he encounters, unbeknownst to him, Victor's younger brother, William. And though initially he wants to befriend William, once he finds out that William is Frankenstein, he kills him, seeking vengeance on his creator, Victor. He also frames the family servant for the death of William, and her name is Justine Moritz, and she's eventually found guilty for the murder of William and killed. Victor Frankenstein at this point is back in Geneva, and he does nothing to prevent the hanging of Justine. So is culpable really in her death in many ways. Eventually, Victor and the monster finally meet. The monster meets his creator, and he asks Victor to create a companion, a wife, to help alleviate his suffering. They have this amazing meeting in the Alps, sort of famous mountain range of romantic poets. And Victor agrees to do that eventually and travels to the sort of remote northern part of Britain in the Orkney Islands and begins creating a companion for the creature, but eventually decides he doesn't want to do it and tears it to pieces. The creature, on discovering this, is enraged, murders Victor's best friend, and also promises to take revenge on Victor on his wedding night. Victor returns home via Ireland, where he's temporarily imprisoned, wrongfully accused of the murder of Henry Clerval, his best friend, who the monster has murdered. He marries his adopted sister, Elizabeth Lavenza, who predictably is murdered on the wedding night. Victor thinks that the monster wants to murder him, but he murders Elizabeth. And then Victor ends up pursuing the monster all the way to the Arctic, where he eventually dies on Walton's ship. The monster comes in at the very end, and though seeking revenge on his creator, Victor, eventually mourns his death and heads up off into the Arctic wastes, presumably, though not definitely, to die. The thing about the book, I think, that must be remembered is that it's created, its structure operates along what's called an embedded or a nested narrative. So the outer frame is told by Robert Walton through his 4 letters at the start, and that covers a time span of about 9 months. The middle frame, Victor telling his story to Robert, covers chapters 1 to 24 in the 1831 edition. But within that frame of storytelling, we hear the monster's account to Victor. And I think that particular structure has a couple of functions. I think first of all, it generates a sort of a tension as we move towards the center of our mystery, but also maybe a plausibility and authenticity as we get through letters and then reported speech. But I think it also makes us aware of the biases of the narrators and how they leave gaps for the creative reader to sort of imagine themselves into the world. There are moments where, we're getting things fourth or even fifth hand. So, for example, the creature's account is reported to us by Victor, who then reports it to Robert, who then reports it to his sister. I think another thing to remember before we get into the sort of themes is that the title. So it's called Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Prometheus, which means forethought, was a titan punished by the Olympian gods. Titans were former gods who had been ousted by the Olympian gods led by Zeus. And he's punished by the Olympian gods and Zeus for stealing fire from humanity. And that sort of myth was brilliantly told in Aeschylus's Prometheus Unbound, sort of Greek drama, which was very dear to Percy Shelley's heart, Mary's husband. So she would have encountered that myth very much through her husband, but may well have read it herself before that. Prometheus also has a slightly different function in myth as well. He's said to have created man from clay, and that's brilliantly rendered in the Roman poet's book Ovid's Metamorphosis. And just the images there on the right are Prometheus waiting for the goddess Athena to spark his clay version of man into life. The picture on the left there is what happened to Prometheus when he did steal fire. The gods chained him to a rock, or Zeus did, and consigned his fate to be that his liver will be picked out by an eagle every every night, and it would grow back. So there are themes of the consequences of acquiring knowledge and providing knowledge, but also of creation and creation myths that the novel's title refers to. But what are the origins of this book? I think the story of the creation of the book is almost as remarkable as the book itself. The book was written when Mary Shelley, who was born Mary Godwin, was 18 years old. And the story of that creation is, as I said, fascinating, to the extent that when the third edition of the book came out, the publisher asked Mary to write an explanation of how she came to write the book. And she says, "I am the more willing to comply because I shall thus give a general answer to the question so very frequently asked of me, how I, when a young girl, came to think of and to dilate upon so very hideous an idea." So how, as a young girl of 18, did I manage to produce this text? I think to understand that, we need to know something about who Mary Shelley was. She was born, as I said, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, the daughter of two very famous writers and thinkers, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was a radical revolutionary philosopher whose book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, is kind of one of the earliest and most important books of feminism. William Godwin was a radical political philosopher and proponent of utilitarianism and anarchism, and very skeptical of large state institutions or religious institutions. The thing about both their parents then is that they're very much outside the box thinkers and radicals, and that, I think, transmits into Shelley's work. Just as an aside, we know that Mary Wollstonecraft's mother was actually lived in Ballyshannon in Donegal. And we also know that Bram Stoker, of course, creator of Dracula, and his grandmother was also from Ballyshannon. So I don't know what was in the water in Ballyshannon and Donegal, but if you're thinking of writing a Gothic novel, maybe go there. So Mary read and was deeply influenced by those two parents. But I think one of the most fundamental moments in her life was the death of her mother, which occurred 10 days after Mary's birth, her mother died of postpartum infection. Um, so she lost her mother effectively. She never really had her mother in infancy. After that, she enjoyed a relatively happy early period of her life. She was beloved by her half sister, Fanny Imlay. That was Mary Wollstonecraft's child from a previous relationship, and got on very well with Louisa Jones, her father's housekeeper and governess, who became a sort of substitute mother. Unfortunately for Mary, uh, Louisa Jones started a relationship with one of Godwin's political protégés or thinking philosophical protégés, George Dyson. And Godwin did not approve and effectively exiled Louisa from the household. So at 3 years of age, Mary Godwin loses another mother figure. Then in 1801, her father remarries a woman called Jane Claremont, who has her own two children called Charles and Claire. Um, and this is a really difficult relationship for Mary. She gets on very badly with Jane, and to the extent that distress that that relationship causes is so bad that she actually ends up developing a psychosomatic skin condition. She comes out in boils and is often sent away for treatments on the coast. In 1812, at the tender age of 14, Mary is sent off north from London to Dundee, hundreds of miles away, to one of the father's very sort of loose associates, a guy called William Baxter, and actually lives with the family for a couple of years and looks on sort of in envy at their close family bond. At 16, she meets and falls in love with Percy Shelley, very famous young emerging poet, and is immediately disowned by her father. Percy, Mary, and her half-sister Claire head off to the continent. It's Claire, her half-sister, and Mary seemed to have been in a relationship at the same time with Percy at this point. Mary becomes pregnant, and in 1815, after coming back to England, she gives birth to a baby girl, Clara. But unfortunately, the baby dies within 2 weeks. Mary is understandably devastated at this loss. She is somewhat disturbed that Percy seems less affected by it. There is this remarkable passage in her diary at this time, which is oft quoted, but still its effect, I think, is really powerful and speaks to Frankenstein, I think. On 20th March, she writes, "Dreamt that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire, and it lived. Awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day, not in good spirits." So that you can get a sense of the deep trauma that this has caused, but also that notion of trying to rub the child back to life again. This view of trying to revivify obviously enters into Frankenstein. The 21st of January 1816, her second child, William Shelley, is born. He later dies in 1819 from cholera. And in the 30th of December 1816, Percy and Mary finally are able to marry as Percy's first wife, Harriet, commits suicide while pregnant. So, what were the immediate contexts then for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? And we'll come back to those early trauma in a second. So we know that quite a lot about actually how she created it. We know that in May of 1816, she traveled with Percy to Geneva with Claire Claremont, her half-sister, and they often stayed at the Villa Diodati, which was Byron's rented villa. He was staying there with his physician, Polidori. At Byron's request, they started a ghost story competition. So Mary, Polidori, Percy, and Byron all tried to write a ghost story. And it was in June of 1816 that Mary wrote her first draft of Frankenstein. Oddly enough, Polidori would go on to write one of the other very famous Gothic figures, a book called The Vampire, which Bram Stoker drew on for his Dracula. So two really famous Gothic monsters emerged from this time. What's interesting is that 1816 is now known as, or was known then as, the year without summer. There was a huge eruption in Mount Tambora in Indonesia, and from that eruption, a huge amount of sulfur and ash flooded the atmosphere and caused a drop in temperature and a kind of pall of darkness across Europe and beyond. This caused famine, social panic, civil unrest. There was the real fear that the world was ending. And Byron sort of captures something of this apocalyptic mood in one of his great poems called Darkness. Um, and in that poem, he said, I had a dream which was not all a dream. So he's drawing on this experience of this sort of darkened, colder Europe to write this poem, to kind of imagine a world in which the sun sort of bleeds out. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. Rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. The world was void. The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships, sailless, lay rotting on the sea. The waves were dead, the tides were in their grave, the moon, their mistress, had expired before, the winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. I think what's important about this poem is that and about this event in 1816, is it really brings home the terrifying, unpredictable power of nature. And that resonates, I think, very much with Frankenstein, with its concern about man's hubris in attempting to control or protect or comprehend nature. So Shelley is in this really remarkable environment with these great writers in this sort of very strange time when it's, winter all year round, effectively, things are dark. And in the course of trying to think up a story, she has a dream, a sort of waking nightmare, which really to me is the sort of the seed of the book, and everything that's great about the book sort of emerges in this waking nightmare. And she tells us in her 1831 preface about this experience. She says, I saw with shut eyes, but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling before the thing he had put together. So she imagines this scientist or alchemist who has made this being and put it together. And then we see the reaction that that scientist, that student has. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half vital motion. So here we have the student or the scientist bringing this being to life with his powerful engine. So some sort of scientific apparatus. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. So she's suggesting here that the scientists attempt to adopt the power of creation only mocks the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world, whether that's nature or God, and that his product will only ever be a pale shadow of the real human, okay, or the ideal human. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slightest spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing which had received such imperfect animation would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of the hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. So essentially what she's saying is that the scientist, having created this kind of thing, tries to sleep it off, tries to leave, but the thing pursues him and has watery, speculative eyes. So he's conscious, he's self-aware, and that this is this sort of horrific idea that makes its way into Frankenstein. The book itself, once it was published in 1818, the initial print run was 500 copies, and it was published anonymously. In 1822, a second edition was published that was attributed to Mary, but I think the dramatization of the book was what really popularized the story. There was a very famous play at the time called Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein by Richard Brinsley Peake. And Mary Shelley actually went to see it and wrote to a critic, Leigh Hunt, having come out of the performance. She says, but lo and behold, I found myself famous. Frankenstein had prodigious success as a drama. So you see there that like in these early sort of dramatizations, the book begins to take off. And by 1831, it was a genuinely popular novel and has remained so ever since. But what about these biographical resonances that we might detect in this story about a student in the book, Victor, creating a monster? So in the book, just as in the dream we just looked at, Victor creates a creature, which he then rejects as a grotesque abomination. The creature is essentially, or the monster is essentially motherless. And it's hard not to see an affinity between Mary and the creature, who is also motherless. Mary, who was in some ways rejected by her own father, and in many ways lived without a mother, or if she did have one, that mother was antagonistic and abusive to her. And just as the creature, as we saw in our synopsis of the plot earlier, looks on longingly at the life of the Lacys, critics have seen a similar parallel with Mary, who observed the Baxters, who she was sent to as a teenager, and looking at them from a lonely distance. So these biographical resonances, I think, are fairly clear. There's other interesting, I think, if I can get my PowerPoint to work. There we go. There's other interesting resonances between Victor and Percy, Mary's love. Victor's Frankenstein in the book has been read as a composite of Mary's father, William, and Percy, her husband. We know that Percy used the pseudonym Victor for early publications of his poetry, and we also know that he had a beloved sister called Elizabeth, who Victor does in the book. Percy was also fascinated by science, death, and the macabre, and was also very interested in electricity and galvanism, and we'll talk about that in a second. Percy also was a questionable parent. He had essentially abandoned his first wife, and as we noted, showed relative indifference to the death of his first child with Mary. Godwin also is a clear parallel for Victor. The monster's quest for vengeance against Victor has been read as a sublimated expression of Mary's own ambivalence towards her father. So what's interesting is the book, when it was first published, honors the father, William Godwin, with a dedication to him, but it also has this quote from Milton's Paradise Lost: "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from the darkness to promote me?" In this section of Milton's Paradise Lost, Adam is sort of upbraiding God. He's sort of in an argument with God for making him. And Adam, of course, is the first man, and the monster is often called Adam in the book. And he expresses bitterness towards God, who's this distant creator, after God casts him out of his paradisal home of Eden. And of course, Mary, in some ways, was cast out of her home. So there's huge, I think, parallels between Mary and the monster in these sort of intertextual quotations. What's interesting is the first victim, William Frankenstein, invokes a whole slew of people relevant to Mary's life. So William, obviously the name, relates to Mary's father, William Godwin. So we could see the monster's killing of William as a form of sublimated patricide. We also know that she had a half-brother called William, who sort of replaced her in her father's affections. So we could regard it as a type of fratricide. And then finally, and perhaps most disturbingly, William Frankenstein in appearance resembles Mary's second child, William, who also had lively blue eyes, dimpled cheeks, and curling hair. And in a way, this could engage Mary's fears that, like a child who's abused herself, she will herself commit acts of violence upon her children, that there's this sort of terrible cycle. And that, in many ways, probably one of the most challenging aspects of the book, the way it asks us to think about questions around parenting and potentially dysfunctional, abusive parenting. This question of birth and enwombment is also very clear in the structure of the book. We know that the first letter that Walton writes back to his sister is dated December the 11th. His final letter is dated September the 12th, exactly a 9-month period from conception to birth. That actually corresponds to Mary's third pregnancy with Clara Everina, who she was pregnant with as she finished Mary Shelley, when she finished Frankenstein. We also know that the time span of the novel can be reliably dated, and this is Charles Robinson's done some great work in this in his Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, The Frankenstein Notebooks. He says that we can reliably date it from December 1796 to September 1797, which those dates align with Mary's own conception and birth. She was born the 30th of August 1797, and her mother died, as we know, shortly after that. So there is huge sort of parallels there with this notion of birth and enwombment. And throughout the book, there is question of birth comes out a lot. So the critic Margarita Georgieva has studied the sort of imagery of birth, and she says Mary writes about Victor who labors or is in painful labor day and night. This verb is used 12 times, along with birth 6 times, babe 1, infant 5 times, child 27 times, followed by various combinations of gave life and create itself used 17 times. And in chapter 5, when Victor infuses a spark of being into the lifeless creature, he's immediately appalled at the creature that he's birthed. He shirks back in horror at its dull yellow eye, its shriveled complexion, and is disgusted by its skin. And some critics have read this as a sort of a nightmare version of an idealized birth. Mary herself described the novel as her offspring and her hideous progeny. And that focus on birth, I think, aligns Mary with Victor in some ways, who's a lightning rod, I think, for her own fears about being a parent. And I think this speaks very much to the notion of the book as engaged with what's called female Gothic. That's a term that Ellen Morris introduced in Literary Woman, and she understood it as a coded expression of the fears and anxieties experienced by women linked to things like menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, marriage, and domestic life. I think specifically in Frankenstein, this is a book that is very interested in what could go wrong in parenting. And I think Anne K. Miller sums it up very nicely when she says Frankenstein explores the natural fears of a very young woman embarking on the processes of pregnancy, giving birth, and mothering. As many such newly pregnant women have asked, what if my child is born deformed? In Shelley's phrase, a hideous thing. Could I still love it? Or would I wish it had never been born? What will happen if I cannot love it? Am I capable of raising a healthy, normal child? One reason Shelley's novel reverberates so strongly with its readers, especially its female readers, is that it articulates in unprecedented detail the most powerfully felt anxieties about pregnancy and parenting. And I think what this speaks to, I think, is the book's awareness and exploration of what you might call the duality of human nature, what Shelley calls the mysterious fears of our nature, the gap that we often experience between our ideal, our public selves, and then our hidden, more instinctive, more violent selves. What Emily Dickinson, I think, brilliantly calls our self behind ourself conceals. And what's particularly, I think, strong and radical about this book is that it engages with thoughts and feelings that were particularly taboo in early 19th century Britain. You know, parents, particularly mothers' potential indifference towards their child, a child's desire to kill their parent, or indeed interfamilial relationships. In the first volume, or the first publication of Frankenstein, Victor and Elizabeth, who he eventually marries, are in fact maternal cousins. But I don't think it's simply a book about, we can read it outside of these sort of quasi-autobiographical dimensions. To read it in that way, I think, is useful, but there's also a lot more happening here. It's also a novel deeply infused by the sort of philosophical, scientific, and political developments of the time. It's written in a period that's referred to as the Enlightenment. That's a period that stretches roughly from the late 17th century to the early 19th century. And this was a period of profound scientific, technological progress in Europe. And it built on an earlier scientific revolution with people like Isaac Newton, which sought to develop new ways of understanding reality through reason, skepticism, experiment. And there was a belief that through these methodologies, we could come to a total understanding of our world, its geographies, its material, its biologies. Victor in the book is very much an Enlightenment figure. He tells us in chapter 2, the world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness akin to rapture as they unfolded to me are among the earliest sensations I can remember. He believes he can, and he wants to understand the hidden, immutable laws of nature. And the Enlightenment is often seen as in opposition to older forms of knowledge via tradition, or organized religion, or myth and miracles. Scientists begin to replace religious figures, priests, ministers, and prophets as sources of knowledge and religious power. In Mary Shelley's preface, she alerts us to her awareness of these scientific developments. And she tells us, many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was devoutly but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. They talked of the experiments of Dr. Darwin, who preserved a piece of vermicelli in a glass, till by some extraordinary means it began to move with voluntary motion. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated, galvanism, and given a token of such things, perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with warmth. So these are the chats that Percy and Byron are having, and Polidori are having, that Shelley's keenly aware of. And she was very aware of the new science that was emerging. In terms of that science, the big influences on Frankenstein are certainly principally these three thinkers, Humphrey Davy, Erasmus Darwin, and Luigi Galvani. We call them scientists now, but that actually wouldn't have been the phrase that was used. That wasn't a term coined until 1834. They would have been called natural philosophers or cultivators of science at that point. So the first one, Humphrey Davy, he was very instrumental in developing the field of electrochemistry. He was the first president of the Royal Society of Science. And Mary Shelley had read two of his most influential works, a discourse introductory to the course of lectures in chemistry and his Elements of Chemical Philosophy. The important thing about Davy was that he argues that a master science purpose is to modify and change the beings surrounding him, and by his experiments to integrate nature with power, not simply as a scholar passive and seeking only to understand her operations, but rather as a master active with his own instruments. In other words, science can understand nature, but its job is also to modify nature as its master. And that we'll see that play out in terms of Victor's attitude towards the natural world. The second figure I mentioned there, Erasmus Darwin, and we'll just show him there in the middle. He wrote two very influential texts, Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life, and a long poem called The Temple of Nature. And in that, he theorized how all life came from what he said one microscopic ancestor. So this is really a very modern view of how life came about, a single filament from in the water by physical-chemical means. He tells us in his poem, organic life began beneath the waves, hence without parent by spontaneous birth rise the first specks of animated earth. That would go on to influence his very famous grandson, Charles Darwin, and his theories of evolution and the origin of the species. But the basic point here is that Darwin believed that life was self-generating through random acts of chemistry, which was a radical new way of thinking about life at the time, and Shelley was aware of this text. This question of the vermicelli, which he reanimates, people have misunderstood that as a piece of pasta that somehow Darwin reanimated. But actually, what this is really referring to is vorticella, which were type of small microorganisms. Microorganisms. Darwin, in his Temple of Nature, refers to these. He said, some of the microscopic animals are said to remain dead for many days or weeks when the fluid in which they exist is dried up, and quickly to recover life and motion by fresh addition of water and warmth. Thus, the vorticella, though it discovers no sign of life except when it's in water, yet it is capable of continuing life for many months, though kept in a dry state. So the basic point he's making is that there are these creatures that appear dead, but they can be revivified by water. And that's what Shelley, Percy, and Byron are interested in, not reanimating a piece of pasta. So it got lost in translation somewhere there. They're interested in reanimating these microorganisms. And that feeds into this notion of revivification in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But I think most famously and perhaps most horrifically, there was a belief perpetrated by Luigi Galvani, very famous Italian scientist, that electricity was the life force. And he conducted numerous experiments on frogs in particular, making their legs kind of jump and move. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, performed very, very famous experiments, one of which Mary would have been aware of, an experiment in 1803 where he actually took the corpse of a dead and executed prisoner, a guy called Thomas Foster, and he attached electrodes to it. And he tells us the jaw began to quiver, the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and the left eye actually opened. A motion of the head was manifested in a convulsive action of all the muscles of the face. The lips and eyelids were also evidently affected. The conductor has been applied to the ear and to the rectum, accelerating the muscles, contractions much stronger than in the preceding experiments, almost to give an appearance of reanimation. Vitality might perhaps have been restored if many circumstances had not rendered it impossible. So these are ideas about science and reanimation that filter into the book. What's interesting is that Gothic novels often sort of depict older, darker forces or supernatural forces from the perspective of a more enlightened, scientifically objective, rational present. what's interesting about Shelley is that she explores the potential for the dark side of science and the enlightenment and progress and technology that these three scientists were promoting. So the question we might ask in terms of all this is, why does Victor create the creature in the first place? Well, he tells us that he's interested in penetrating into the recesses of nature and to show how she works, and nature is always feminine. Notice the gendering. So he's not only interested in sort of pursuing these sort of internal laws of nature, he tells us that he was hoping to make what he calls, quote, a new species that, quote, would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. So, in a way, Victor seems very motivated by a deeply egotistical vision of himself as this sort of godlike patriarch over a new species. Obviously, the the consequences of the nature are a deep critique of that hubris, that masculinist, megalomaniacal use of science. And some critics have viewed nature as a feminine force resisting Victor through the storms that it sends his way. And he's always ill and he always gets infected by diseases, that nature is working against him in terms of his attempt to create and to usurp nature's power of creation. And ultimately, he's punished, like Prometheus is, by the goddess nature for stealing her power. And I think that what's interesting is that in many ways, Victor is more the villain or the monster than the monster in this book. He is the classical mad scientist who pursues knowledge without care for its consequences. He's also a deeply cruel father. He leaves Frankenstein, he leaves his monster um, to fend for itself, having created it. He also begins to create and then ruthlessly destroys the female creature, telling us that he, trembling with passion, tore to pieces the thing in which I was engaged. And he notes later that the remains of the half-finished creature whom I had destroyed lay scattered on the floor. I almost felt as if I had mangled the living flesh of a human being. And finally, he allows Justine to suffer the consequences of William's murder. He tells us Justine died, she rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my brains. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description of horrible. I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. So, in other words, he's aware that what he did was wrong, but he could have stood up. He could have told the magistrate that Justine was innocent, even if it meant appearing like a madman. He could have done it, but he didn't. So, in many ways, he is much more monstrous than the monster that he creates. And we also have a comparison. Walton mirrors Victor's ambition and his ambition in many ways. He is seeking knowledge. He is seeking what he tells us is the secrets of magnetism. And after meeting Victor, he tells him how gladly I would sacrifice my fortune, my existence, my every hope to the furtherance of my enterprise. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of knowledge which I sought. So, in that sense, he's as ruthless as Victor is at the start of the book. But Victor warns him against this in what he says is the intoxicating madness of his ambition. And Walton's men, when they get trapped in ice, try to turn back, try to convince Walton to turn back. But even though Victor is aware of the perils of ambition, he actually then upbraids the men and says, "Oh, be men, or be more than men, be steady to your purpose and firm as a rock." He encourages them to continue on with this polar expedition, even though he, more than anyone, should know the perils of such ambition. But Walton, unlike Victor, does turn back. He does save his men, and some critics have attributed that to the influence of his sister. He tells us, "I've lost my hopes of utility and glory. I have lost my friend," that's Victor, "but I will endeavor to detail these bitter circumstances to you, my dear sister, and while I'm wafted towards England, towards you, I will not despond." So Robert Walton offers a contrast to Victor. Eventually, he comes to the realization that some things are more important, perhaps, than the ruthless pursuit of knowledge. In terms of the influence of the book, then, the hideous progeny, as Mary calls it, I think it's influenced a whole range of books. It's not just a popular novel, I think, it's a whole mode of literature. And as the critic Alan Rock says, the novel is arguably one of the most influential works in the conceptual practice of science and technology. It forces us to ask questions about maybe the naivety or the optimism of the great thinkers and technologists of our era. And just an example of that, Sam Altman, who's the CEO of ChatGPT, which obviously some of you are familiar with, in an interview, he tells us, and of course, that is AI, artificial intelligence, is smarter than us. Of course, it can do things we can't, but also who really cares? And I think writers and artists like Mary Shelley care. And there's been so many films and books that have asked us to think carefully about the consequences of our technological innovation. And there, I think, have been really important safety valves for technological and scientific ambition. Some of these books, and films, I'm sure you're well aware of on screen. Another example I just want to point to is Samarth Kulkarni, who's the chief executive of CRISPR Therapeutics. This is a very, very powerful gene editing company. And he says, we're going to think of medicine very differently 50 years from now because we're not going to be popping pills. We're going to do one-time procedures to change your genome, and hopefully you're preventing disease or completely curing yourself of disease. He seems to say this without, to my mind at least, due care for what that could mean. And again, the inheritors of Shelley in films like Gaga or Elysium or Splice or recently The Substance, they ask us to think about the possible negative consequences of a world in which genes can be manipulated or in which genes can be tracked and monitored. Let's finally then think about the creature. What's his significance in all of this? In some ways, we could make a very good argument for the creature as a monster. After all, he does kill three people, William Frankenstein, Henry Clerval, and Elizabeth, and by proxy, Justine and Victor, you could argue. He's also grotesque in appearance. He himself considers himself a monster. He's also superhuman, hybrid. He has preternatural strength, can endure real extremes of hardship and cold. What's interesting to me, though, is that in the book, he's also highly articulate. In later film versions, he's made less articulate or indeed dumb, perhaps to make us more comfortable with the idea that he's a monster. I would argue that really he's a figure that asks us questions about the human, animal, and indeed non-human boundary. Because in the book, at least, he has a very rich cognitive life. He's self-aware, he's highly articulate, he teaches himself to read, and he reads highly sophisticated books. He himself says, I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. So he's a product of his circumstance, not born evil. And his actions can really be seen in the context of unremitting prejudice and rejection. And what he sort of provokes in us, I think, is really uncomfortable questions about how we delineate and define humanity and how we differentiate between humans, subhumans, monsters, and who gets to decide. He tells us, I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was besides endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. When I looked around, I saw and heard none like me. So he has the disadvantages of poverty, physical deformity. He's also thought of through a racist lens. He's called a savage inhabitant from some undiscovered island. And those racist stereotypes were, in Shelley's time, based on pseudoscience, were used to justify things like slavery, which was still legal in the British colonies at this period. It was used to justify colonization and the denial of rights to a whole host of people, including women, of course, of which Mary was obviously one, in terms of access to education. So in some ways, the creature offers us a rebuttal to all those in society who dehumanize and exclude people from human sympathy. And notably, the creature's moral circle extends even to the animal kingdom. He's more benevolent, I think, to the animal than the human. He says, my food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berry afford me sufficient nourishment. Of course, the audience today I'm speaking to are Irish. What about Ireland? At this time, Ireland was a colony of Britain, was subject to all sorts of stereotypes that labeled Irish people subhuman. This is documented extremely well in the book The Eternal Paddy by Michael Denai. Initially, of course, Victor does travel to Ireland. He's imprisoned, wrongly accused of the death of murder of Henry Clerval. And initially, he does seem to buy into stereotypes of the Irish, calling them that they had frowning, angry countenances and were rude and had ill-looking faces and the look of brutality. But he changes his opinion on the Irish owing to the work of Mr. Curwen, who's the magistrate that investigates his case. And he does it very carefully. And that causes Victor to change his opinion. He says, there were my first reflections, but I soon learned that Mr. Kerman had shown me extreme kindness. So he changes his opinion to the Irish people. And Fred V. Randall's article, The Political Geography of Horror in Mary, comes to this conclusion about Mary's depiction of the Irish. He says, Mary Shelley temporarily posits, then decisively discredits stereotypes about the Irish that supported England's colonial dominance. The novel's treatment of Ireland, like its treatment of other places, and the monster himself, suggests that the violent revolution can be best averted by recognizing the humanity of stereotyped groups, hearing their complaints, and generally addressing their grievances. Ironically, perhaps, Ireland itself was framed as Frankenstein's monster in the political cartoons of the time, most famously in 1882 in response to the Phoenix Park murders. And this is Charles Sturt Parnell, famous nationalist in Ireland, trying to control his Irish monster there. So to conclude then, what I'd say is the monster is not the monster. The creature's treatment of society reflects our all too human capacity to make monsters out of those who are different to ourselves. In making others monstrous and subhuman, we ourselves become monsters and lose our humanity. And I think that, the book could leave us with a very negative, dark, dystopian view of human life, but I think that it offers us at least two possible futures. We might understand those as being represented by Victor and then the book itself. The first version of our human future is what you might call transhumanism. This is a view that science and technology can and should be used to transcend the biological and intellectual limits of human beings. And that theory, I suppose, tends to embrace or extend enlightenment, anthropocentrism, human beings at the center of things, and faith in science, although it tends to promote, I would argue, a relatively narrow conception of the human. And it also has a high potential to exclude people. If we do develop technologies that allow us to extend our life, who will get access to those technologies? What races, what classes of people will get access to them? So that's one version which Victor, I think, seems to articulate. The second version, I think the more healthy version, is articulated by the novel itself. And this is a more post-humanist view of our human future. This is an idea about humans' place in the world, that it's more attentive to the potential social and ethical impacts of technological adaptation. It's more careful in thinking about technology and how augmentation of human might have positive and negative effects. It stresses our interconnection with the natural world. We are not these distinct masters of it. We are deeply interconnected with a complex ecological system, and climate change has really brought that back to us. And it asks us to reconsider what we mean to be human. The category of the human, it argues, has always been an invention, and it has always included and excluded certain people based on race, class, ethnicity, ability, and gender. And a book which, to my mind, seems to pick up on that view of Frankenstein is a book called Spare and Found Parts, that some of you may be interested, by Sarah Maria Griffith. And that reimagines Frankenstein in Ireland, in Dublin, 100 years after the present, and indeed offers us a much more sophisticated and developed version of Frankenstein than many of the films that sort of imagined it in the years since its first production. So that's something, if you're interested in this more post-human future, that you might want to check out. So finally, just as a sort of way to end it, I want to go back to our Irish giant. He specifically stated that he did not want to be buried or to be taken for dissection or displayed within some sort of museum. And he asked his friends to make sure that on his death, he was buried at sea. Unfortunately, a man named John Hunter of the Hunterian Museum in London managed to get his corpse and displayed it in his museum very successfully for over 200 years. And I can't help but see a link between this figure and the monster. Like him, he's dehumanized, he's judged by his appearance, and he's ultimately objectified in the name of science. But thankfully, since 2023, he's no longer exhibited in the Hunter Museum. And I think finally is getting the dignity that he deserves. Mary Shelley, I think, would have approved. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Simon. So I'm just going to have a quick check for any questions. So just one we have is, do you think the book was totally against all scientific innovation?
Okay, it's a good question. I think just this was building on the conclusion there. I think what Mary Shelley would say is there are, very positive possibilities here in terms of technological innovation, but that we need to be really, really careful about the potential effects that these will have on ourselves and on our world. So she's not against it, but she is arguing for a much more careful examination of it. And obviously Frankenstein does that.
Okay. So I think we can, oh, we have another question here. Oh yeah, so someone's just asking, can we send on the resource after? Yep, we'll email it to you. You'll get the entire video and the slides as well. So I'll just conclude it there. So thanks everyone, and
Okay.
thanks Simon.
Thanks very much.